An alien showed me where dinosaurs really went, and they're not extinct. Those 8 words could have ended my career if I had said them aloud in the right room, at the right conference, with the right posture. I learned early to hide the most dangerous parts of what I found. For 40 years, I kept a polite distance from the parts that made colleagues smile a little too thinly, the parts that made grant officers frown, the parts that mothers pointed out to their children as just a story. I became fluent in footnotes and hedged hypotheses. I learned the language of caution. And yet, there is a moment in everyone's life when caution becomes a kind of cowardice. For me, it was a night of too many late shows and a documentary that ended with the same rehearsed line. The dinosaurs disappeared. Some catastrophe. Chalk it up to time. I remember sitting on my couch, surrounded by boxes of paper, field notes, journal reprints, photographs of worn hieroglyphs, an old postcard of Giza that had been rubbed smooth at the corners. The television recited the comfortable narrative, the one that fits in textbooks. My chest tightened, not with anger so much as with an ache, the ache of a story half told. That ache is where the blue light found me. It was not the Hollywood flare of a saucer, no dramatic saucer trail across the sky. It seeped in through my curtains like a suggestion. Pale and steady, it pooled on the carpet, bathing the room in a soft, cool glow. I remember thinking, absurdly, that the color matched the spine of a book I had read as a younger man, the small volume on ancient measures and harmonic intervals that had convinced me, briefly, that geometry might be a grammar of the cosmos. The room changed shape under that light. The boxes of paper became islands, my books cliffs. And then a presence filled the space between me and the light. Hot as drawn breath, distant as a satellite, immediate as the zipper brush of wind along bare skin. The being did not walk into the room. It unfolded there, a handful of angles and a face I could not quite name, and a voice that arrived not through ears but directly in thought. Not words exactly, but the crisp, translated sense of words. "You have been keeping knowledge like a wound," it said. There was no accusation in the thought, only a steady observation. Will you let it heal by remembering what was stored here? I am telling you this as a testimony. I do not pretend to convert logic to glow. I do not ask you to accept claim as fact. I can only say what followed felt as real as breath and as indelible as ink. The being touched the world with a kind of attention. It offered a sequence of images like chapters pulled from a book no archivist knew existed, and then it invited me to look. They built it to remember. That line became a kind of key. The alien, if I must use that label, kept returning to the phrase in images and in the quiet commands that shaped them.
Not, "they built it to conquer," or "they built it to rule." The intent I saw was preservation. The structures we call monuments, these great late-glow stones and pointed crowns of gold, were not memorials in the sense we imagine. They were active, engineered devices for keeping life, for encoding memory, for sheltering what the builders believed would otherwise be lost. You have to imagine the construction the way the alien showed it to me. No scaffolds of timber and sweat, but a choreography of states. Stone that rose like a fluid, directed by hands that were both mechanical and ritual. I saw blocks that did not fall. They suspended a breath above each other while invisible forces nudged them into place. Limestone was cut with a precision that sang when struck. The sound was not accidental, but function. Crystalline lattices were installed in cavities the size of rooms, and the capstones, the ones gilded until they flashed like stars, sat like the lids of resurrection boxes. There were men and women in the images, certainly, skinned deep with sweat and roped with duty. But around them moved other entities, taller, luminous, moving without the gait of humans. The alien narrated without interrupting the stream of images. We taught them to use geometry as grammar. We taught them how stone can hold a pattern of vibration, how a set of frequencies will coax matter into a behavior that appears to you as levitation, as cohesion. Listen, I use words like levitation and vibration because that is what the images showed me. The being used other terms, terms that sat somewhere between physics and liturgy. For those builders, sound and number were not metaphors. Frequencies, 432, harmonics of bass intervals, crystalline resonance were tools. They tuned the chambers like luthiers tune a violin. They tuned the Nile's channels as if adjusting breath through a reed. Water was run through patterns of metallic and mineral matrices that hummed at particular pitches. The river's flow became an instrument of purification and storage. Sediments did not simply settle and decay, they codified. They built it to remember, the alien thought again. And now I understood that the memory it spoke of was not only of names and deeds, but of living forms. The builders anticipated cycles of collapse, of fire and flood, of plagues that sweep and return. They saw that the fragile web of life could be unraveled over a reckoning, and thought, if we can hold a pattern long enough, we may be able to weave it back. The mechanism, as the vision made plain, was not crude preservation like a jar on a shelf. It was dynamic and living. Chambers acted as accelerants for biochemical stasis. Crystalline arrays stored information not merely in atoms, but as active patterns that could be read and reconstituted.
There were codices, literal records etched into metal and stone, and, astonishingly, into living tissue, into sequences that, when exposed to the right harmonic, unfroze and hummed like a sleeping choir. If you are skeptical, and you should be, you might ask, what is the evidence for any of this in our world? I will tell you the alien's answer, because it was a part of why I was chosen to see. Evidence is not always left in plain sight, it communicated. Some evidence is caretaken. Some evidence is laundered into myth. Some is misfiled by those who profit from the forgetting. And with this came the whisper of custodians, secret societies, temple orders who had been given fragments and instructed to guard them as ritual. It was not a simple conspiracy. The alien's tone suggested something longer and stranger, a pact of stewardship, split between different factions, some who saw themselves as keepers and others who hoarded. That custodial history, the alien suggested, explains why certain doors remain closed in the present day, and why certain chambers leak only partial echoes of their former function. The first vision closed like a book. The light dimmed and reconfigured. When I exhaled, I found myself standing alone in the past, on the raw limestone plateau that would one day be named Giza. The pyramid sides were not yet scarred by weather. They were smooth as bone. Craftsmen ran hands along the stone and smiled when the stone hummed back at the correct interval. A capstone was set, and the whole complex breathed, soft, audible, like the intake of a deep animal. Then the alien said to me, simply, "Enter." The second sequence would be the one that would make every private lamp of doubt burn hotter. It was not only about the institutions and the engineers, it was about purpose in the deepest sense. The golden age the alien showed was not a parade of pharaohs with triumphal chariots. It was an architecture of initiation and of what I can only call restoration, an effort to bind living patterns and to hold them through cycles. The temple interiors were darker, lit by an inner shimmering that reflected off metal and water. Initiates arrived barefoot, wearing nothing but the seriousness of being taught. They were led by those who had been trained by the luminous ones. There were sarcophagi in vaults, yes, but not as tombs of the dead. These were instruments. A body would lie within, but the device around it did not stop the heart by design.
Instead, it modulated frequencies through the skull, focusing on a small, peculiar gland in the brain. The alien allowed me to feel what those initiates felt. A pressure that was not pain, but unmooring. A loosening of the tight narrative self until memory could be read and rethreaded. This was how they restored what was lost, the alien said, not by asserting dominion, but by reweaving pattern. They could write a template into the stone, into the water, into the flesh.
Then, should storm take a lineage, the temple could call the template back. And here is where the story shifts, where the claim grows heavy and impossible to tuck into an academic paper. The preservation was not only for human lines of descent. It encompassed the broader family of life. The builders took seriously the mix of species, every sound, every vibration, every pattern of movement. Creatures that roamed the world were considered part of the memory that required safekeeping. In the vision, the alien guided me through a narrow passage that smelled faintly of mineral oil and old sap. The passage opened into an enormous chamber I could have sworn could not fit under the plateau. A cavern built with a mind for scale. At its heart stood a ring of what the alien called keystone nodes, pillars of stone embedded with crystalline arrays and shallow pools. Around them, enclosed but not caged, were habitats that looked like collapsed islands of jungle and marsh, ringed by glass-like shields that shimmered when you walked by. In one enclosure, something large and long-necked bent its head to drink from a pond. Its skin bore patterns that glittered under the interior light. For a moment my reason protested. My memory forced the smooth, book-labeled name of the creature, but I could not pin the genus with certitude because it was not an animal in a book. It was a living continuity of a line we had termed dinosaur. Then the alien's thought touched my own. They were moved, it said, a simplicity like an axe cut. Not all died in a single fall. We collected, we seeded, we curated. We could not save everything, but we did not allow every pattern to vanish. It is crucial here that I insist on framing. The alien's narrative was not, "This is what science confirms." The alien showed me, and I report the vision. It is a testimony from my perspective. But in that testimony there was a logic. The builders anticipated cycles and created refugia, distinct spaces where biological patterns could be maintained or paused. Some of these refugees were terrestrial, hidden deep under bedrock or beneath the shifting sands. Some were veiled in resonance, phased so that the organisms within existed in a slightly off-register state, visible to the temple's tuning, but otherwise imperceptible to the passing eye. And some were carried outward, into vessels that left the planet, preserved in suspended matrices that might, in time, be returned. I watched, in the vision, a juvenile, small, fleet, eyes like black catchments, move with an elegant, curious caution among decorative ferns. Its breath steamed in the artificially tempered air. A member of the temple staff, not unlike a gardener but with the intent of a conservator, extended a hand and laid a palm against the creature's flank. The creature's throat made a sound low as a bell. There was tenderness there. The alien's telepathic echo told me, we did not always come as conquerors. Often we came as midwives. What the alien implied without saying outright was complicated. The Anunnaki, as the vision framed them, were not monolithic. There were those who saw themselves as preservers, who constructed the architectural net to hold life. There were those who saw potential in recombination and experimented with the threads. There were those who made bargains with local elites to ensure safety in exchange for knowledge. Some parts of this arrangement were altruistic. Others leveraged suffering into advantage. The vision did not absolve anyone. It simply laid out a history rich in nuance, preservation, stewardship, experimentation, and the uneasy politics of secrecy. As the scene pulled back, the alien folded over me the way a teacher closes a book. We seated survivors where we could, it thought. We blended in pairs, and we stored templates. Over cycles, many things changed. But some lines were kept, sometimes on Earth, sometimes away. We thought it wise to keep what would be useful to a re-emerging biosphere and what might be needed to teach. This word, teach, was repeated like a bell. The builders did not intend immortality as a gift of static life. They intended archives that could be read by those with learning and care. The temples were not vaults that locked away life forever. They were laboratories of continuity. Their aim, as the alien made plain, was the ability to call forth pattern in times when the usual web frayed. There were other images, too, that I had not expected. I saw vessels, ships not of bone and sail, but of integrated lattices of crystal and alloy. These vessels held matter in a state the alien called suspended coherence. Organisms inside did not decay. Their patterns were held in a vibration that could be restarted by the right coaxing. Some of these ships left the planet, silent as seeds on a wind. Others remained, under deserts, under mountains, their exits sealed until a time of return. The alien never framed this as judgment, only as necessity. We feared the rip, its thought said, and we were practical. I have to confess that at this point in the vision, my skeptic's mind tried to rearrange everything into more palatable metaphors. Perhaps this was a metaphor for genetic seed banks, archives of DNA and embryo. Perhaps the preserved beasts were not the living animals, but records so complete they could be reanimated in some future laboratory. The alien, perceptive of my inner argument, smiled in that slow alien manner. Words you use will shift the image, it communicated, with something like compassion. You may call it storage, seed banks, ark. Within your language, choose a term that keeps the possibility open. Then, with a movement I felt along the edge of my perception, the vision shifted again. The chamber, elegant, slow, meticulous, gave way to a sense of time folding. I saw a map, overlaid on my mind. Pyramid nodes like points of a constellation, the Nile like a spine through a soft tissue of land. I saw corridors of influence that radiated outward, trade routes, oral traditions, myth that contained kernels of real procedure. The alien traced the lines with thought. These nodes were not isolated, it said. They connected. They shared frequency. They were designed to form a net. The net could only hold if enough nodes were functioning. That, in the alien schema, is where our modern history enters. Over millennia, many nodes ceased to function. Some were destroyed by nature, others by human hand. Some had their knowledge siphoned into ritual and myth, meaning the operational core of the network became a story told at the hearth, and parts of the technology were forgotten. The result was a contemporary world where the monuments stand as mute stones to most observers, and yet pulses of their original operation leak into culture as myth and as sudden, inexplicable synchronies. The alien then showed me the present-day echo. You have probably felt it. A shiver of recognition when you touch stone, a sudden tear when you hear a certain sound, a dream that repeats a place you have never visited. These are not, the alien suggested, merely neurochemical accidents. They are memory traces from the network. Some people are more sensitive to the net because of lineage, because of prior initiation, or because of simple resonance. But most of us brush past these currents like ships passing in fog. And then, right when I believed the vision had begun to complete its arc, the alien did something else. It turned its attention directly to me, not to the map, but to the occupant of the couch, the archivist of notes, and the man with the book-rubbed postcard. You have been asking why certain lives have vanished, and why some lines are preserved, it said. You have a question about the dinosaurs. This was the moment the title condenses into an image. I felt the air in the room tilt. A silence like the mouth of a well opened in my perception. I had come prepared to be shown architecture, ritual, technology. I had not been prepared for a species-level answer that threaded paleontology into temple work. But the alien did not hesitate. They were not all lost in a single hour, it thought. Many were culled by catastrophe. Many perished. But we accounted for lineages that held deep pattern. We could not save every form. We preserved what we could. Some of these patterns we kept alive on the planet in hidden refuges. Some we carried away. Some we placed in states between states, accessible only when the network sung. The words landed like stones. They were an answer and an evasion, both specific and deliberately ambiguous. The alien's image sharpened into a single room at the heart of the complex, a repository that looked, in my memory, like a cathedral crossed with a greenhouse. There were glass domes and suspended gardens, age-old trees potted in soil lines, water filters that hummed like a distant organ. In niches, creatures slept beneath veils of light. In the far corner, something large raised its head and regarded me. An animal with a face I recognized from museum dioramas, but animated in a way no exhibit had ever managed. "Are they alive?" I asked, not aloud. The telepathic contact had made speech redundant. My own voice felt ridiculous and small when compared to the vision. "Yes," the alien replied, and there was no theatrical flourish to it. "Not all in the same manner as you, but in living pattern they persist. We held them." It is important. The claim is that dinosaurs, or at least lines we call dinosaurs, exist in curated refugia, sometimes on Earth, sometimes off-world, sometimes in phased states. The alien's explanation was both practical and ethical. The preservation had been done partly out of reverence for diversity, partly out of calculation, partly out of a desire to keep templates that could help reweave ecological patterns if the planet's nets frayed beyond repair. There was also an honesty about hubris. The builders meddled, and sometimes meddling created demands. Why keep them, I thought, a question that tasted at my own pride as a scientist. What purpose does a Cretaceous herbivore serve in a world of mammals and cities? The alien's thought was gentle. Patterns, lessons, the capacity to recall certain modes of being. There are rhythms in large bodies that teach an ecosystem how to move. There are shapes of flora and fauna that usher certain cycles. You call it dinosaur, and you mourn its loss. We called it part of a grammar. To lose that grammar, we feared, was to risk losing songs we could not reconstruct. All of this happened before dawn. When the vision folded and I found my hands on the lino of my living room floor, the blue light had gone. My chest hurt with remembered awe. The boxes of paper were the same boxes, and the postcard of Giza sat unruffled. My notes, which by habit I keep beside the bed, were blank where I had intended to write down the most crucial parts. Memory, that fragile clerk, had sealed some of the edges. But the impression, the weight, and the shape of it remained. The image of a long neck in a protected pond would not leave my mind. That evening, or rather in the blurred hours after, I did the thing every modern witness of extraordinary claims does. I tested my own limits. I read into the night, returned to old field notes, and found in obscure glosses references to keeper gardens and watered vaults, words that, in their context, had been translated as metaphor. I cross-referenced a line in a 19th century travelogue that mentioned something like a nursery under the sand. Nothing there proved anything, but pattern was pattern, and patterns make a kind of argument of their own. A week later, I started to place pieces of the experience online, small, cautious, because hiding knowledge is different from stewarding it. If you want more stories like this and the guide pinned below, subscribe. I typed under the short video I made of my couch and the blue light. It felt strange to dangle a CTA after such a private encounter, but the alien had taught me about nets. Knowledge needs nodes to vibrate. The invite was not a demand. It was a way to gather those who might resonate. Responses came in the forms of emails, messages, and the kind of private notes people leave at the foot of a shrine. Some readers told me to publish everything immediately. Others admitted they'd felt the pull of similar dreams. One woman, who called herself Mara, wrote about a dream of walking through a glass dome and seeing a creature she could not name. A retired engineer sent a 2-paragraph note with a scanned photograph of a lattice he had found beneath a temple floor years earlier. He had dismissed it then as decorative. Nothing proved the vision, but the web was stitching itself. The alien, through my continued meditations and later contacts, yes, there would be more, kept insisting that the revelation was not merely trivia about where ancient fauna had been placed. It kept returning me to a moral imperative. If something is preserved for the future, what obligation does the present hold to it? The builders, the alien suggested, were not infallible. They were caretakers who sometimes judged imperfectly. Our job, if we accept the witness, is not to repeat their errors, but to learn the ethic of care they attempted. I say, if we accept the witness, because I am aware of how this all reads. A careful mind will note the lack of external verification. A careful mind will ask for samples, for coordinates, for corroborating data. I offered none publicly at first. There were reasons beyond mere secrecy. Some knowledge, I found, becomes dangerous when wielded by impatience. But that restraint also bred suspicion. Many who read my initial notes called me fantastical. Others called me brave. What I could do was what I had always done: collect testimony, cross-reference, and be honest about the limits of my claim. I invited correspondence. I began to structure my life differently. The dream had altered more than my filing system. It had shifted my priorities. The boxes of paper had new urgency. The blue light, the alien's voice, the image of the domed refuge, all of it pressed. And then, in an email that felt like the physical thump of a new chapter, I received an invitation. Not from a human, not from a society, but phrased in the same clear telepathy as the first contact. Return. The net still hums in places that will let you step through. There remains a chamber not yet sealed. My chest tightened. Part of me, the old scholar, recognized this as a pivot point in narrative arcs. The step between seeing and bearing witness, between vision and verification. Part of me, the person who had watched long documentaries and eaten the cold coffee of lonely research nights, knew the dangers, trapdoors of loaning, of the imposter syndrome that invites you to overclaim. The alien's invitation was an opportunity and a test. I packed with the obsessiveness of someone who has long carried too much hope in small boxes. Field recorder, fresh notebooks, clean shirt, a ring I did not wear otherwise. I did not tell the colleagues who would laugh gently at the sight of me leaving. I did not take many items that belonged to the life I might have to put down. The invitation, in its way, asked for readiness, to witness, to be taught, to be a steward of a truth that might upend reputations. When I arrived, the site did not look like a set piece. The modern tourist paths skirted the edges, and the guards were, to all appearances, bored with the same rhythm of footfalls and cameras. The alien's presence did not manifest in light this time, so much as in the hum under my feet, an almost inaudible vibration like a plucked string at the edge of hearing. Then the earth moved with a slow precision. A slab shifted. A stair revealed itself. The texture of my breath changed with the air of the underground. Before I stepped down, I remember repeating under my breath the line the alien had given me that first night. They built it to remember. It was an invocation, a map, and a warning. The stairway led into a corridor that smelled of old river and metal. Light fell from nowhere in a phosphorescent pattern that made the stone appear as if it had been polished the day before. Symbols I had seen only in photographs, lines of geometry, nodal points, glowed faintly and then dimmed. The corridor opened into a chamber half the size of a city street, and at its center was an opening, not an arch but an iris of stone and crystal. As it turned, a breath of air passed across my face that tasted of distant leaves. I had the sense then that I stood on the thin place between what had been told as myth and what had been kept as practice. The doorway opened like a memory returning. "Are you prepared to learn why the builders kept certain lines?" the alien asked. There was no malice, no heavenly trumpet, only the patient curiosity of a teacher. I inhaled. The chamber beyond the iris vibrated at a frequency my teeth could feel. Behind that threshold lay at once the fulfillment of the title I had whispered into my own life, an answer to the question of where dinosaurs went, and the beginning of a responsibility I had not asked for. I stepped forward, and the light closed, like a lid. The air inside was warmer, fragrant with green things I could not have named. In front of me, the first glimpse of living history moved through a haze of steam and light. The thing lifted its head and regarded me with an expression that, for lack of a better word, was like attention. Its eye, rounded, patient, a black mirror, caught the soft interior light and held it. The sound it made was not a roar. It was a quiet modulation of breath that set the air shimmering. When the creature moved, the humidity in the chamber shifted, not wind so much as the translation of mass into motion. Around us, ferns trembled as if remembering a season long past. I took a step, and the floor answered with a faint thrum. The walls sang. They folded the node's frequency into the air like a harp string. A woman in the far corner, a keeper whose face had the patience of soil, turned at my entrance. She wore no insignia I recognized, no uniform of a known order, only a cord around her waist, threaded with tiny crystal beads that caught the light and scattered small suns across the pools. Her hands were ink-stained with sap and mineral dust. When she moved toward the shallow pond to drain and refresh it, the animal lowered its head and the thrum softened, as if acknowledging a long friendship. The alien's presence settled around me like an explanation. "See them as patterns," it said, not with arrogance, but with the precision of someone who has taught many reluctant students. See what their presence taught a web. Patterns. The word uncoiled something inside me. I had spent my life cataloging fragments, a motif on a tomb, an anomalous inscription, a traveler's aside about a nursery under the dunes. I had built a career on the work of inference. But inference is brittle when held against an organism breathing and blinking and regarding you with an attention older than your divisions of time. The juvenile beside the pond turned its head slowly, nostrils flaring, and I felt the absurd urge to apologize for my species' impatience. The alien, never a looming figure, more of a river of intent, pulled my perception to the perimeter. You expect cages and ossuaries. We do not like cages unless necessary. We build conditions. We supply rhythm. We maintain templates. Some are patterns of tissue, some of sound, some of bone. We are not the architects in the sense you believe. We are gardeners who tend permutations. It described, as succinctly as its translation allowed, how the refugia functioned. The core idea was always the same: hold a pattern in a way that allowed reactivation. The temples lowered metabolic rates with harmonic frequency. Crystals focused electromagnetic fields in tiny, locally controlled envelopes. Water channels carried minerals and colloidal matrices that, when combined with a particular pitch, would slow physiological processes to a metastable state. In some refugia, the pattern was maintained biologically, living creatures kept in scaled, carefully managed ecosystems. In others, the pattern existed as a dynamic record. Living tissue interleafed with latticed crystalline codices that could, when fed with correct frequencies and nutrients, seed a new organism into being. Some leave the planet, the alien added. Some remain woven into the bedrock. We do what we can where we can. We do not save everything. We choose a grammar. I listened, and the room translated the alien's words into images for me. I saw a ship interior folded inward like a seed pod. I saw canisters of mist and slow-frozen embryos surrounded by humming filaments. I saw a plant with leaves as wide as a man's arm, coated with tessellations that reminded me of ankylosaur dermal scutes. It was not elegant in a way that sought to please a historian. It was efficient. They had been, according to the vision, pragmatic stewards. Some compassionate, some clinical, some curious enough to breach a taboo and experiment. The alien met my implied question, the one that asked if this was a matter of sacred duty or of cold calculation, with a level tone. We are not simple. We made choices. Choices have consequences. And then the alien invited me deeper into the dome. We walked, by will, not by foot, through rooms where the air was kept at different ages. A corridor smelled of peat and the low sweetness of ancient fern. Another corridor tasted of iron and salt, and a small cluster of birds the size of my fist darted between hanging vines. Their song threaded a frequency that nudged my memories loose like unspooling film. In one room, I watched a herd move across a sculpted plain rendered in living soil, and I realized that the keepers had learned to mimic climates, microclimates engineered to simulate epochs. The past, in these places, was not frozen, it was coaxed. At a stone workbench sat a group of people, some locals, some not, attending to a creature's wound. Their instruments were not barb and scalpel alone, but a mixture of acoustic tools and mineral slurries. When the keeper playing a tuning fork at a particular pitch touched the wound, the tissue contracted and reknotted itself as if remembering how to knit. I held my breath, and, though I had seen many strange things in the vision, this act struck me with an unnameable ethical weight. Here was life being spared, perhaps altered, perhaps improved, perhaps changed in ways that no standard lab could easily account for. Not cures, the alien said, anticipating my hesitation. Not miracles. Management. Stewardship. It is important to be precise about how things felt in that chamber. I did not experience a Hollywood crescendo of spectacle. There were no cinematic leaps into man-made holiness. The scenes were calm and deliberate. The keepers moved with a restraint I recognized from the best fieldwork I had ever done. Careful, non-invasive, patient. Their language, if you can call the small tapping and the shifting of slate into patterns language, spoke in procedures. It felt, above all, like a set of long habits designed to protect more than it did to trump. As we stood at the rim of a larger enclosure, the alien's attention turned outward toward time. We seeded templates in living faunas, and we seeded templates in records, it said. Why? Because a web is more than an organism. A web needs grammar. Grammar. Again, the language of pattern and syntax. The alien explained that some taxa had traits that acted as keystone grammar, attributes that helped shape ecosystems and behaviors of other species. Large herbivores, for instance, modulated vegetation growth and waterways by sheer presence and movement. Predators taught prey to move different ways, and those movements changed landscape. To lose certain large bodies, the alien said, was to lose certain dances in the web. When the alien framed the argument in terms of grammar, I could almost hear an ancient linguist nodding in approval. The builders were less interested in nostalgia than in preserving a functioning lexicon of life. I asked, because I could not help myself, whether any of what I was seeing could be brought back wholly, whether the world could be returned to some prior balance. The alien answered not with a promise, but with a calibration. Some balances are irrecoverable. History is not a book that you can unwrite. We seed and we teach. We do not pretend to turn back all clocks. It did, however, insist on the utility of keeping templates, genetic, acoustic, behavioral. Call it a rehearsal kit, it suggested. A set of instructions for reweaving should a weave fail catastrophically. The rest of the vision that day moved in beats, small, revealing moments that together gathered into a larger moral picture. I watched a keeper feed a juvenile with a paste the alien claimed was a nutritionally calibrated prime, minerals, microbial cultures, colloidal matrices that mimicked archaic gut flora. I watched temple acousticians alter the pitch of a chamber and watch bony plates along a creature's flank distend faintly as if syncing to an unseen conductor. I watched a conservator lay a hand on a fossilized femur and chant, not in a script I recognized, but in a harmonic pattern that seemed to align sediment layers with memory. If you are wondering whether the vision presented a singular theory, if I expected a tidy package labeled "This is how to access the refugia," you will be disappointed. The presentation was careful, almost bureaucratic. Here are nodes, here are protocols, here are contacts. The alien conveyed not a treasure map, but a system, and systems resist simplistic translation into coordinates or passwords. The more I looked, the more the image of a network, interconnected, redundant, and veiled, made sense. Some refuges were physical cavities wrapped under monuments we know, others were more like states of resonance that required a certain tuning to perceive. It is at this point I must return to the human actors in the story, the custodians who, in the alien's narrative, had held pieces of the net. The alien spoke frankly about broken pacts, about orders that had split along moral lines, about those who had hidden shards for safekeeping and those who had hoarded knowledge for power. That tension is what made the network brittle in certain times.
It also explained, in the alien's account, the presence of ritualized nonsense, practices that had survived as empty ceremonies while their original technology lay dormant in other hands. Guardianship requires humility, the alien stated. Any keeper who forgets humility becomes a jailer. I felt the implication as if it were a physical weight on my shoulders. The keepers in the dome were humble. They spoke in small movements and gentle corrections. When I reached out to touch the juvenile, because old instincts die slowly, the keeper stopped me with a smile that did not embarrass me, but set a boundary. "Observation is a responsibility," she said. "You can witness, you cannot possess." I took the boundary seriously. Some part of me, trained in the languages of publication and proof, wanted to reach into my pockets for camera plates, for measuring devices, for the language of measurement. Yet the room seemed to rebuke that instinct. In the presence of living presence, measurement felt like a kind of violence, unless done with consent and care. The keeper gave me a small token, an amulet with a single crystal lattice embedded inside. It was not an access key. The alien, translating in thought, made that point. "It is a remembrance," it said. "It will help you to remember the feeling of restraint." We moved on. The alien then guided me to a quieter vault, one that seemed more archive than greenhouse. Here lay arrays of metal and stone and organic tissue woven together, each item labeled in a script older than any alphabet I knew. Inside sealed cases, I saw strands of tissue arranged with crystalline filaments, tools of measurement and reconstitution. On a slab of basalt, in a script that appeared in my mind as much as on the stone, there were lists, taxonomy of sorts, but not by modern Linnaean lines. These were patterns classified by function, by rhythm, by ecosystem impact. "These are curations," the alien said. "Not trophies, not hoarded curiosities, templates." The voice carried no triumph. It was technical and a little weary. We expected cycles. The patterns we kept were chosen for utility and beauty. Both matter. I asked then about the custodial politics. Who decided which patterns were kept, and who enforced rules of access? The alien's response was careful. There were councils, it said, human and non-human. There were agreements and disagreements. There was theft and there was protection. That is human history, mixed motives wrapped in ritual. It told me, too, about a crucial principle the builders had used when deciding to rescue or archive a lineage: redundancy.
No single node contained an entire pattern. Instead, multiple nodes held overlapping aspects, acoustic signatures in one place, tissue templates in another, behavior codices in yet another. The idea was elegant and maddeningly complex. Even if one node were destroyed, the pattern could be reconstructed from fragments.
It is, I realize now, a system built by those who anticipated loss and therefore leaned into distributed preservation. Yet distribution is only as good as the will that maintains it, the alien observed. Will decays, institutions forget. That awareness brought us back, inevitably, to the present-day situation. I asked, because I could not help myself, whether any of these refuges were still accessible to ordinary people. The alien's answer was a soft correction. Accessible is a word you use, it said. The net responds to resonance. Those who come with humility and patience are noticed. Those who arrive with greed are repelled. Some doors open by design to shepherds. Others wait for a maturity you cannot claim by attendance alone. It was a diplomatic way of saying what the keepers had silently enforced in their domes. Access was not a function of passports or money. It was a function of relationship and rhythm. I recognized in that a sort of ethical scaffolding. The builders had not intended their network to be a museum for the curious, but a living system maintained by those who understood responsibility. The more the alien spoke of stewardship, the more I thought of my own life. 40 years of cataloging, of cautious publication, of hedged sentences. It felt like a lifetime of polite conservation, compared to the raw intimacy I had just witnessed. I had been an archivist at a distance. Now I stood among people who actively tended living memory. The alien noticed my inward recalibration. You have been chosen to notice, it said, not in a way that flattered, but in a way that set a charge. To carry what you can and to leave what you must. You will not be the first. You will certainly not be the last who tries to vulgarize the work. Guard your tongue, guard the stones. There was then a moment of pause, not in time. The net here had little patience for theatrical suspensions, but in the unfolding of events. A keeper offered me a narrow couch, a sarcophagus of sorts, but open and warm. We will not make you sleep, she said. We will give you a chance to align. You may decline. Decline felt like denying a calling I had only just recognized. I lay down, the cushions conforming like living matter. The room shifted pitch. The ceiling above me danced with the reflection of water, and I felt the vibration of the node move through my bones, as if the very sentence of me had been retuned. There was no anesthesia, no drug. The experience was one of resonance, a tuning process applied to a self that had forgotten certain frequencies. If previous visions had been external, this initiation was internal. I did not travel in the way I had earlier. Instead, the layers of my memory unfolded. I was not only present in my present body. I felt, as the alien had once promised, threads. I tasted images of other times, small bright flashes of tending and of failing. I saw someone who might have been me in another age, pacing a terrace while herds walked a plain. I felt the ache of losing those herds to something called the rip, and I felt the hum of determination to save what could be saved. I felt also the sting of pride, decisions made hastily, a species selected because of its utility rather than its right to exist. I saw negotiations with kings and with those who would be pharaoh. I saw bargains struck, knowledge for protection. Some bargains protected, others compromised. In that compressed landscape of retrospection, my bitterness, years of being dismissed by colleagues, of footnotes that read like handcuffs, began to recede. Not because the vision flattered me, but because the work of care out of which these builders had operated was slow and sometimes humiliating. My life of careful scholarship had value in the network of stewardship. My bitterness had not. The initiation was, among other things, an excavation of the petty resentments that had calcified around my work. It did not remove them by decree. It offered perspective. Perspective, as I learned then, can be a form of healing when it connects you to a task larger than your ego. When the resonance receded, I lay in the couch, and the keeper watched me with an expression I will not forget. "Many who come see only what they wish," she said, "and then leave with a cause. A cause is not a stewardship." The alien's telepathic voice, then, was soft but firm. "You will be given pieces. You will be tempted to give them away as answers. Instead, hold them as invitations." I left the chamber different in small, practical ways. My jaw felt less clenched. My hands were steadier. The postcard of Giza would still sit on a shelf and gather the dust of years, but there was now a rhythm to my steps when I walked to it. I had been issued a mission, but it was not the messianic type I had feared. It was a practical stewardship. Collect testimony, protect viable knowledge, teach restraint, and cultivate community. My return to the surface was not cinematic either. The slab shifted the way it had opened for me before. The stair closed. The hum under my feet faded. The air in the courtyard tasted like ordinary day. The tourist booths hummed with the muffled banalities of the modern world. My phone buzzed with late-night messages I had left unsent. My inbox contained the expected skepticism and the expected flattery. The world, in its mechanical indifference, waited. I kept what I could in the months after, some of the images, many of the impressions, the small amulet from the keeper. I wrote cautiously. I did not publish the coordinates of the refuge, nor did I name keepers beyond a description. Part of that restraint arose from practical concerns, part came from the new ethic I had been asked to practice, that access without responsibility is theft. But I did begin to organize. The alien's pattern of distributed nodes suggested that if knowledge was to survive, it needed more nodes. Not more secrets, but more guardianship. I started by forming a small correspondence circle, people I had met online after the first video, a retired conservator, a field ecologist with a taste for odd plant taxa, a woman who had dreamed, as the keeper had said, and a linguist curious about non-Latin taxonomies. We spoke often and slowly, setting down rules for stewardship. No coordinates shared, no implausible claims made, testimonies cross-referenced where possible, and an emphasis on preparation rather than revelation. We organized a pilgrimage of sorts, not as a raid, but as a careful invitation. Those who answered the call were not thrill-seekers in t-shirts, but people who had renounced certain kinds of spectacle. They were cautious, patient, and, above all, capable of holding discretion. I can say now, after many evenings spent in debate and prayer and coffee, that the group formed slowly into a kind of modern guild. A small node of people committed to learning the language of pattern and of listening to the stones before speaking about them. On the pilgrimage, in a different place and time, I experienced a partial, public activation, not the chamber of the refugia, but a temple whose nodes were only half-tuned. Visitors that day reported subtle changes, tears, a release of old grief, sudden clarity about long-held choices. I do not tell you this as proof of a mechanism that will work for anyone. I tell you because it was a shared event, and because it reassembled the alien's assertion that some places still carry hums that can affect people. Some of those affected later described it as an opening, others as a simple shift of perspective. The keeper's principle resurfaced. Experience without stewardship can be a wound. We tried to teach the pilgrims to carry what they had experienced with humility. I was criticized for leading these journeys, and I understand why. Some accused me of exploiting the narrative, of creating spectacles. Others accused me of hoarding knowledge. The criticisms did not all stink. Some were necessary corrections. Good stewardship, I learned, must accept critique. But there were also attacks that came from an uglier place. People who wanted to take the story and use it as currency for fame. That sting taught me to be more circumspect about what I revealed publicly. The aliens' communication, which continued in small impressions rather than dramatic visits, reinforced that circumspection. "You are a bridge," it said, "but not a highway. Bridges must bear load, but not become the entire road. Let others build their paths." That counsel guided me. I published essays, careful, hedged, and rich in qualifiers, about memory, stewardship, and the ethical implications of preserving biological grammar. I archived oral testimony, consolidated records we had, and encouraged the creation of small, regulated seed banks in legal contexts that mirrored the ethic of the builders: redundancy, openness to peer review, and an emphasis on restoration rather than exploitation. Some reading this will ask, did we find proof? Did we bring back a dinosaur? The honest answer is no, not in the way popular culture imagines. We brought back testimonies, a small compound of artifacts corroborated by different independent discoveries. Nodal architecture traced in unexpected temple floors. A fragment of crystalline matrix whose properties matched no known industrial sample. An indigenous oral history that echoed what we had seen. None of these items constitute incontrovertible proof in the laboratory sense, but pattern builds argument, and pattern is how I have always worked. There were also moments of unmistakable personal confrontation with doubt. On several occasions, a member of my small circle urged disclosure of coordinates under the pretext of scientific verification. Those debates were messy and honest. We ultimately decided to follow the keeper's axiom: consent and responsibility precede revelation. We refused to hand over locations to those who might not respect the ethical limits required by the work. We did, however, share methodologies for listening and for preparing oneself to be a better steward. How to hold testimony, how to cross-reference oral histories, how to sensitively engage with custodial communities. A few years on, the network we had fostered began to yield smaller, quieter fruits. An engineer in our circle found an anomalous harmonic in a set of stones she had cataloged in a temple floor. A linguist identified a non-literal taxonomy in a manuscript that resonated with the pattern classes the alien had orally described. These were small wins, the kind of scaffolding that suggested we were building a distributed archive of our own, node by node, testimony by testimony. And the dinosaurs? How are they now? The alien's explanation, which I have accepted as a testimony rather than a declarative history, seems to hold consistent across encounters. Some lines persist in refugia, some exist as templates awaiting reactivation, and some were carried beyond this world. In one of our more speculative conversations, frankly, the sort of talk one has after hours, around coffee cups and under the protective cloak of confidentiality, we debated what would mean to reintegrate a line into modern ecosystems. The answers were not scientific in the laboratory sense so much as practical and ethical. How would a Cretaceous mega-herbivore fit among modern mammals? What diseases might it carry? What patterns of movement would it impose on altered landscapes? Would humans be capable of reciprocal adaptation, or would our presence only replicate the pattern of past extinctions? Those questions, and the humility that accompanies them, are what have shaped our group's cautious approach. Today, my life seems, in some ways, smaller, and in others, vaster. I still keep my boxes of papers. They sit precisely because of what the alien taught. Memory needs caretakers who are not in a rush. I still publish, always with qualifiers. I still attract scoffs and strange emails, and I have learned to accept both with an equanimity I did not have before. My role, as the alien put it, and as the keepers reiterated, is to be a steward of testimony and an instigator of careful curiosity. If you have read this far and feel the strange pull, whether it is wonder, cynicism, or secret hope, then you are part of the broader network of resonance the builders once imagined. Perhaps you have had dreams similar to those my correspondents shared.
Perhaps you have touched stone in a temple and felt something unnameable. Perhaps you have seen a photograph of a fossil and felt grief so sharp it surprises you. These are not credentials for access. They are signals of resonance. What matters is what you do with that resonance. Do you hoard it, trade it, weaponize it, or do you let it teach you restraint? I close with the honesty of a witness, not the certainty of a prophet. The vision showed me one plausible account of where dinosaurs went and how they were treated by those who could tend patterns. It showed me the ethical knots that come when one species gains the capacity to preserve another. It taught me that stewardship is not a project you complete and archive. It is a practice you keep alive through small acts of restraint and care. If this resonated, check the pinned comment for the guide Reconnecting with Your Divine Essence and consider joining our small community. Share your experience in the comments. If nothing else, consider this an invitation to look differently at the monuments you pass, at the myths you were taught, and at the living world that still hums beneath the veneer of modern life. They built it to remember. We, perhaps, are still learning how to be the kind of people worthy of that remembrance.